You would think, perhaps, that a princess born in gold would be blessed by heaven. But what if I told you she was born without eyes? Not blind, not damaged, simply eyeless. No sockets, no lids, no lashes, just smooth, porcelain skin stretched across the place where sight should begin. They wrapped her in lace, in silence. The crib was carved from walnut, inlaid with pearl. The canopy shimmered with the coat of arms of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. But the only sounds in the chamber that night were the broken breath of a midwife, the choked sob of a nursemaid, and the silence of a king. A silence deeper than grief. It was recognition, because what stared back at him, without staring, was not a child. It was consequence. Her name was Maria, but outside the eastern wing of the palace, no one ever heard it spoken. There was no public blessing, no official painting. The royal portraitist, who had immortalized the births of 5 generations, was never summoned. When asked why, he simply said, "What is not seen cannot be painted." The queen, still young and fragile, refused to hold the infant, not out of cruelty, but out of terror. She cried at night, whispered that the child was watching her, that she could feel her thoughts being listened to, that the girl's face was a question God refused to answer. But the child did not cry, not like other infants. She listened to footsteps, to breath, to wind pressing against old stone. She would tilt her head slightly toward sound, never startled, never lost, just waiting. Her father, the king, a man molded by duty and hollowed by heritage, gave one command: she will not leave the east wing. And so, behind velvet curtains and shuttered windows, a child grew, unseen by her kingdom, a flower in perfect darkness. No tutors were summoned, but once they brought her a musician, a blind man with fingers worn thin from decades of sorrow. He played the lute, and Maria listened, not with delight, nor with sadness, but with something deeper, like someone remembering a song they never learned. She never spoke at first, but one day, when a servant entered carrying a tray, the child turned her face, not toward the scent or the clatter, but toward the woman's heartbeat. "You're afraid," she whispered. The tray fell. Whispers spread, that she knew things she could not know, that she called people by names they never told her, that she spoke in languages she was never taught, that when she walked the corridors, mirrors cracked, not violently, but gently, like glass surrendering. They began to cover the mirrors, not by order, by instinct. Velvet over silver. Candles burned lower near her rooms. Even the light seemed to avoid her. But she was not monstrous. That, they would later say, was the most terrifying part. She was beautiful, not in the way of paintings or poetry, but fragile, sculpted, almost holy, hair pale like winter sun, skin untouched by time. Her face was incomplete, yet somehow whole. And when she turned toward you, you felt seen, not with eyes, but with something ancient, something silent, as if the blood in her body carried not memory, but judgment. And still, she grew, alone, unwritten, undeniable. They called her the child in the East, Never princess, never Maria, only a shadowed phrase that passed between servants like a cold wind through locked doors. She remained untouched by ceremony, no birthdays celebrated, no gowns ordered from Paris, no tutors in Latin or courtly manners. Instead, there was silence. A harpist came once, years after the blind man vanished. She asked him, before he even played a note, why he was grieving. He dropped his harp and left that same night. The maids began walking faster past her chamber. Priests avoided looking in her direction. Even the queen refused to mention her name. It was as if her presence carried weight that language could no longer hold. But she listened to everything. She knew the cooks were stealing wine. She knew the queen was ill long before the royal physician did. She whispered to a handmaid, "Your brother will not return from sea." He didn't. She could not see, but she could feel when someone entered a room and hated themselves. And they said that when she turned her face toward you, you didn't feel judged. You felt exposed, as though your skin wasn't enough to hide the rot inside you. By the time she was 13, there were rumors that the Eastern Wing was cursed, walls that echoed too clearly, candles that refused to burn, paintings that peeled on their own. One night, a visiting countess entered the wrong hallway. She said she heard a girl singing, soft and slow, in a voice that did not belong to this world. The countess left the palace the next morning without explanation. Whispers grew louder, that the girl was not blind, but prophetic, not cursed, but divine, that she spoke with angels, or perhaps things older than angels, that she was punishment for sins no one had dared name. One winter, the king declared a month of mourning. No one had died. But tapestries were drawn, dances canceled, masses held with extra incense. Some say it was for the queen. She had not spoken in weeks. Others said it was for something else. Because that was the winter Maria stopped eating. Not from illness, not from grief, but from something quieter. A stillness that wrapped around her like a second skin. They found her one evening, seated on the floor beside the harp, her hands resting gently on the strings. Not pressing, not moving, just touching, waiting. They called for the priest, not the royal one, a different one, old and afraid. He stayed in her room for 6 hours. When he emerged, he did not speak, only crossed himself and left the palace forever. No death was announced. No bells rang. But the Eastern Wing was sealed the next day. Windows boarded, doors bricked, not as punishment, as preservation, because some said she had not died. She had changed, became something the palace could no longer understand or contain. And what the bloodline could not control, it buried, not in earth, in silence. The silence that followed was heavier than mourning. It was designed, built into the stone, a decision made by those who feared memory more than death. Her name was erased from the line of succession. Her existence struck from records, from family trees, from the court's daily registers. She became a ripple they worked tirelessly to still. But the East Wing remembered, not with voices, with presence. Guards posted nearby reported strange drafts in windless halls, a scent of candle wax and lavender lingering when no one had entered. Some said they heard faint plucking of harp strings in the night. though no musicians had stepped foot there in years. One young guard, barely 17, claimed he saw her. He had fallen asleep at his post and awoke to find a girl sitting beside him, her head tilted gently toward him. She said nothing. She only listened. He wept without knowing why. The next day, he begged to be reassigned. He never spoke of her again. Years passed. Kings died. New generations took the throne. The palace was renovated, expanded, redecorated. But the eastern wing remained untouched, for structural reasons, they said. Children growing up in the palace were told never to go near it. They made up stories, as children do, of ghosts and monsters and mirrors that could see through your thoughts. But every story, no matter how wild, shared one strange, silent truth, that at the heart of that forgotten place was a girl. Not evil, not angry, just waiting. Waiting for someone to say her name. Waiting for someone to remember. And sometimes they did. A chambermaid, lonely and weary, wandered too close and claimed she heard humming. A cardinal, curious and foolish, tried to bless the sealed hallway. He collapsed mid-prayer, trembling and pale. He left the next morning for a monastery in the Pyrenees. No explanation, no farewell. The royal family called these rumors superstition, but they knew, in their bones, in their blood, because every child born to them was watched more closely, eyes checked, limbs measured, and every time a child came into the world with something strange, too quiet, too knowing, too still, whispers returned about the girl who had no eyes but saw too much, and about the mirror she held up to the dynasty that made her, a mirror they dared not look into, because it did not reflect their crowns or their robes, only the cost. There came a time when the Eastern Wing was nearly forgotten. The old courtiers who remembered her had died or disappeared. The walls were patched, repainted, polished. The throne passed into hands that never held her name, and the new royals called it myth, a tale to frighten children, a fiction born of boredom and superstition. But the palace itself knew better. Stone does not forget what blood tries to erase. There was a winter, long, bitter, and still, when a visiting foreign queen stayed in the palace. She was young, clever, and curious. She had heard the rumors and, unlike her hosts, she didn't flinch from them. One night, draped in fur and wine-warm, she slipped from her chambers and wandered alone, lantern in hand, into the old wing. They found her the next morning, kneeling in the dust of a bricked corridor, face pale, lips moving silently. Her maid tried to lead her away. She would not rise. It took 3 men to carry her back. She spoke only once more. Weeks later, before leaving the country and vanishing from all public life, she said, "She heard me thinking." That was enough. The royal family ordered the Eastern Wing permanently sealed, not with bricks this time, but with sanctity. A chapel was built around it, encasing the space in stained glass and incense. No one was allowed to pray there. No sermons were delivered. It became a chapel in name only, a ritual of forgetting. And still, there were signs. A musician once paused outside the walls and said he could hear an unfinished melody. A maid said the dust never settled near the old door, no matter how often she swept. A child once wandered close and whispered that someone had called her name. The child's name was Maria. No one had ever told her the story. They sent her away. And so the curse continued, though it was never truly a curse. It was the weight of consequence, disguised in mystery. The echo of a girl born not broken, but exact. A child who could not see the world because she was born to show it to itself. Not through eyes, but through silence. And for centuries, the palace wore that silence like a cloak. Elegant, heavy, untouchable. It became tradition to avoid mirrors in certain rooms, to draw curtains in particular corridors, to never speak the name of the wing that no longer existed. And yet, in moments when the light flickered strangely, when the harpist's string broke without reason, when a child stared too long at nothing, someone would always wonder, was she still there? Was she ever really gone? She was never truly gone, because what they tried to bury was not her body. It was the truth, and truth, once born, does not die. It waits. In the silence between footsteps, in the breath someone holds without knowing why, in the sudden chill beneath a silk canopy, though the fire still burns. Generations passed, bloodlines shifted, names changed, but her absence remained a presence. The space she once filled, sealed and shadowed, held weight, not of memory, but of reckoning. Somewhere deep inside the palace, behind stones older than nations, there was a room no one dared enter, not because of fear, but because of guilt. The girl born without eyes had become something more than legend. She was the mirror no crown could shatter, the story no historian could rewrite, because she was not malformed. She was perfectly shaped by the very system that created her. A royal line that folded in on itself, generation after generation, driven by pride disguised as preservation, by power masked as piety, by blood that ran too tight, too pure, too poisoned. And in the soft flesh of her face, where no eyes blinked, no lashes grew, that truth stood naked. She had no voice in court, no title, no portrait, no epitaph. But she never needed them, because the walls remembered, and so did the mirrors they covered, and the tapestries they replaced, and the children who woke crying without knowing why. She was not a curse. She was the answer to a question no one dared ask. What happens when power feeds only itself? It creates beauty with no eyes, innocence with no protection, a child with no place in the world that made her, yet more real than the world itself. They crowned others, built statues of conquerors, wrote anthems for kings, but none of them were remembered like her, because her silence echoed longer than any trumpet, her stillness weighed heavier than any throne. And in that forgotten wing, behind velvet and stone, beneath prayers never spoken aloud, she waits. Not for revenge, not for redemption, but for someone to finally look and not turn away. If this story opens something in you the history books never dared touch, subscribe. Because we don't just tell stories. We dig up what the silence tried to swallow. We let the dead speak, and we ask the living to listen. Subscribe now. Let the shadows speak.